crash course into Linux system administration. My goal is to expose you to as much information as possible in the relatively short time we have here together. Because there's nothing worse than not knowing where to start, I created this crash course to point you in the right direction. I may not go into great detail as there just isn't enough time to cover every topic in depth, but when you need to perform a Linux admin task, you'll at least know where to start and understand the broader concepts behind what you're trying to do. Alright, so who is this crash course for? Quite simply, it's for anyone who is at all interested in developing Linux system administration skills, or for anyone who is interested in developing a broader understanding of Linux administration. If you're new to the field of information technology or thinking about pursuing a career in IT, this will give you an idea of what's involved in becoming a professional Linux system administrator. Finally, this video is also great for IT professionals with experience on other operating systems and who are considering adding Linux skills to their resume. Even those who already have Linux experience but want to increase their existing knowledge and quickly brush up on their Linux skills will also benefit from this presentation. I sincerely believe that time is our most valuable resource. That's why I write books and create courses. They're shortcuts to learning Linux and give people the skills and careers that they want in the shortest amount of time possible. Because I want to be respectful of you and your time, I'm going to tell you up front who this crash course is not for so you don't waste your time. If you're only interested in Linux desktops and graphical user interfaces, this crash course is not for you. Now, don't get me wrong, I use Linux as my primary computer every single day, and yes, I use a Linux graphical desktop environment, but to me, that's the least interesting thing about Linux. The real power is found at the command line, and that is where you can get some leverage. That's what can save you time, and that's what gives an individual person just like yourself the power to manage thousands of servers at a time. If you're here just because you're looking to save money, this crash course is not for you. Yes, Linux is free in the sense that you don't have to pay to use it, but more importantly, it's free in the sense that you're free to use it in any way you please, and you're free to customize it to suit your needs. If you're not interested in learning how to use the powerful Linux command line, or you're not interested in server applications of Linux, this course is not for you. Why am I here right now teaching you about Linux? Well, I want to tell you. You see, I actually dropped out of college to follow my childhood dream, which was to be a full-time musician. I played in bars, restaurants, and hotels. I also played music at weddings, music festivals, and private parties. I even spent a couple of years playing music on a cruise ship. And I worked really hard in the music business, but because I really didn't make much money from the music business, I had to get a day job. My parents told me to get a safe, secure job. Did your parents ever tell you that? Well, I hate to admit it, but they were right. So I was looking for job security. Not only did I want job security, I wanted a decent salary after spending many years as a starving artist. So that's why I decided to pursue a career in IT. I created a resume and sent it out to everywhere that I could think of. I applied to job after job after job until someone finally gave me an opportunity to work as a desk side support technician. I was only in that support position for just a few months because I decided that I wanted to learn an in-demand skill so I wouldn't have to worry about finding a job again. It was kind of rather hard to break in to get that first job, but I saw that there were tons of jobs available for people with Linux skills, so I went about learning everything I could about Linux. Soon afterwards, I landed a job as a Linux system administrator, and as they say, the rest is history. Because Linux has given me so much of my life, things like places to live, food to eat, vacations, practically everything, I feel that I need to pay it forward. Now, teaching people Linux skills and helping them in their careers is my personal way of giving back, and that's why we're here today. Now, if you've drifted away, now's the time to come back and look at your screen. If you can stay focused for the next few minutes, you're going to learn a lot, and I promise that. So just put your phone on mute, shut down your instant messaging app, and stay out of your inbox. It's going to be worth it. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning with the Linux boot process. Now, BIOS stands for Basic Input Output System, It's a special type of firmware used in the booting process, and it's the first piece of software that's executed when a computer is turned on. The BIOS is actually operating system independent. Its primary purpose is to test the underlying hardware components and to load a bootloader or an operating system. There are two primary bootloaders for Linux. The first one is Lilo, which stands for Linux Loader, Lilo. The next one is Grub, which stands for Grand Unified Bootloader. Grub has really replaced Lilo at this point, but you may run into some older Linux systems that still use Lilo, so I just wanted to point that out. The primary purpose of the bootloader is to actually start the operating system. It typically does this by using an Init RD, which stands for Initial RAM Disk. The Init RD is a temporary file system that's loaded into memory when the system boots. This file system can contain helpers that perform hardware detection and load the necessary modules to get the actual file system mounted. Once the Init RD mounts the actual root file system, its job is done, and the operating system continues loading from the real root file system. The Linux kernel, the initial RAM disk, and some other files that are needed to boot the operating system are stored in /boot. The Linux kernel is typically named VM-Linux or VM-Linux. If the kernel is compressed, it's named in the VM-Linux format. Now that ends with a Z. When a system boots up, there can be a lot of messages that just fly by the screen. These messages are generated by the Linux kernel. There are two ways to see these messages. The first way is to use the dmessage command, which dumps the contents of the kernel ring buffer to the screen. By the way, that command is spelled DMESG. Now, since the messages are stored in memory in a ring buffer, when new messages get added to the buffer, old messages get dropped off. The good news is that the kernel messages are typically stored on disk in the var log dmessage file. So if something scrolls off the end of the buffer, you can still find it in that log file. Linux uses run levels to determine what processes and services to start. Each distribution can be configured slightly differently, but in general, run level 0 is used to power off a system, run level 1 is single user mode, run levels 2 through 5 are for normal system operations, with run level 5 starting the graphical user interface, and finally run level 6 is used to reboot the system. Traditionally, run levels were controlled by the init program. To change run levels, you would use the tellinit command to literally tell init what run level to use. However, an init alternative named systemd is quickly taking the place of init. It's currently widely adopted, so for the most part, you'll be dealing with systemd. Just know that some distros, especially older ones or some that are not well supported, still use the original init system. Init uses the concept of run levels, while systemd uses the concept of targets. These targets are roughly equivalent to run levels. You can use the systemctl command to change to a desired target. For example, if you want to start the graphical user interface, run systemctl isolate graphical. To stop the graphical user interface and switch back to the command line interface, run systemctl isolate multi-user. In addition to run levels and targets, there are some special commands that allow you to control the system as well. For example, you can use the shutdown command to, well, shut down a system, the reboot command to perform a reboot, and of course the power off command to power off the system. In reality, these just invoke the proper corresponding init or systemd commands. Linux uses the Syslog standard for message logging. This allows programs and applications to generate messages that can be captured, processed, and stored by the system logger. It eliminates the need for each and every application having to come up with and implement a logging mechanism on their own. It also means that logging can be configured and controlled in a centralized location. The Syslog standard uses facilities and severities to categorize messages. Facilities are used to indicate what type of program or what part of the system the message originated from. For example, messages that are labeled with a kernel facility originate from the Linux kernel. Severities, on the other hand, are used to categorize messages based on their urgency. The severities are emergency, alert, critical, error, warning, notice, and info. A Syslog server accepts syslog messages and processes those messages based on a set of configurable rules. Traditionally, the syslog D daemon filled this role, but many Linux distributions now ship with alternatives such as rsyslog and syslog NG. By the way, NG stands for next generation. A syslog service uses configurable logging rules to determine what to do with a given message. These rules use combinations of facilities and severities. In most cases, messages are simply written to a file in the var log directory somewhere, but you can do advanced things such as send the messages over the network to a central location. If you want to generate your own log messages, for example, when you're writing shell scripts, use the logger command line utility. To automatically prune files and keep your disks from filling up with old messages, use the log rotate utility. Speaking of disks and filling up disks, let's move on to disk management. Now, when a disk or storage device is partitioned, it's divided into parts, and each one of those parts is therefore called a partition. Now, partitioning a disk allows you to allocate different sections of that disk for different purposes. There are two types of partition tables. One is the MBR partition table. MBR stands for Master Boot Record, and it's an older technology that can only address up to 2 terabytes of storage space. Now, it's quickly being replaced by GPT, which stands for GUID partition table. Okay, so now the acronym in the acronym GUID stands for Global Unique Identifier. And GPT supports up to 128 partitions and storage devices up to 9.4 zettabyte. A mount point is simply a directory that is used to access the data on a partition. At the very least, there will be one partition mounted on /. Any additional partitions will be mounted on mount points below / in the directory tree. For example, if you allocate a partition for user home directories, that partition would be mounted at /home. The files and directories that are at or below the home mount point will reside on that partition. For example, the files in my home directory /home/JSON are actually on the partition mounted at /home in this particular example. When performing interactive Linux installations, you'll most likely end up using a partitioning tool provided by that Linux distribution. However, if you want to manipulate disks after the initial installation, you need to use a standard Linux tool. The fdisk utility has been traditionally used to create and modify partitions on a disk, but there are other viable alternatives including gdisk and parted. Before a partition can be used by a Linux system, it needs a file system. You can use the mkfs command to create file systems. Simply provide the file system type to the -t option and then provide a path to the device for the partition. Once you have a file system created, you can mount that file system using the mount command. Just follow the format that you see here on your screen. It's mount, followed by the path to the device, and finally the mount point. To show how much disk space is in use the df command, which you can think of as the disk free command. If you want to disconnect a file system from the Linux server, use the umount command. Now, that's unmount without the first N. Supply the mount point or the device to unmount that device. In order to control what file systems get mounted where and in what order, use the etc fstab file. fstab is short for File System Table. The first column in the fstab is used to specify what device you want to mount. The next column is the mount point, or where that partition is going to be attached to the file system. The third column tells Linux what type of file system resides on that partition. The fourth field is used for any mount options that you want to specify. The fifth field controls how the dump backup utility behaves. In reality, no one uses dump any longer, so you can just ignore that column. The final column tells fsck, which is the file system check utility, what order to perform file system checks at boot time. Not only can you use device paths to control mount points, you can use labels and UUIDs. A UUID is a universally unique identifier. To view the labels and UUIDs of the storage devices attached to your system, use the ls_blk_-f command or the blkid command. Each file system type has a utility to create disk labels. For extended file systems, which is one of the most commonly used Linux file systems, you can use the e2label command to set the label of a disk or partition. Let's move on to accounts. Each account consists of a username and a unique number called the UID, which is short for user ID. Also, each account has a default group to which it belongs, some comments associated with that account, a shell to start when the user logs into the system, and a home directory. And all this information is stored in the etc password file. And note that etc password is spelled PASSWD. Historically, encrypted password information was also stored in the etc password file. However, the etc password file is actually readable by anyone on the system, so storing password information, even though it's encrypted, is actually a security risk. So now by default, the encrypted password information is stored in /etc/shadow, and that file is only readable by the super user or the root account on the system. Managing users on a Linux system is fairly straightforward. If you want to create an account, use the user add command, and to delete accounts, well, you use the user del command, and to modify existing accounts, just use the user mod command. Now, these commands here listed on your screen are the low-level Linux commands, and they're available on all the Linux distributions. However, some distros provide their own account creation tools that you can use if you so choose. Just like the etc password file contains account information, while the etc group file contains group information. To create a group, use the group add command. The group del command will delete a group, and to modify a group, well, use the group mod command. To see what groups an account is in, use the groups command. If you specify an account after the groups command, it will show all the group memberships for that specified account. If you happen to execute the groups command without any arguments, it displays the groups that the current user is in. If you want to switch to another account, use the su command, which stands for switch user. To verify what account you're currently using, simply run the whoami command, and it will return the account name. The sudo command is used to allow one user to run commands as another user. This is most commonly used to allow a normal user to execute a program as the super user. So you can think of sudo as super user do. To start a shell as another user, run sudo --s, or you can also run sudo su. By the way, the file that stores the sudo configuration is etc sudoers. To modify the sudoers file, use the vi sudo command. It has syntax checking built in so you don't accidentally break the sudo configuration. Linux servers are most commonly connected to a TCP/IP network, so we're going to spend the next couple of minutes here talking about networking. Now, the TCP/IP protocol is the de facto standard for transmitting data over a network. TCP/IP stands for Transmission Control Protocol and Internet Protocol. For a device on a network to communicate properly, it needs three pieces of information. Those are an IP address, a subnet mask, and a broadcast address. Each one of these IP addresses or numbers is comprised of 4 octets separated by a dot. An octet represents 8 bits and therefore can have a value starting at 0 and going up to 255. The class of an address determines what a portion is used as the network address and what portion is used for host addresses. By looking at the first octet of an IP address, you can tell what class it is in. An IP address with a first octet that falls anywhere between 0 and 127 is a Class A IP address. By the way, IP addresses that start with 0 in the first octet are actually reserved for special use cases, and they're not normally assignable IP addresses. Now, Class B addresses begin with 128.0 and end at 191.255. Class C addresses start with 192.0.0 and end with 223.255.255. A class determines the possible number of networks and the addressable space per network. For example, a Class A network can accommodate about 16 million host addresses, whereas a Class C network can only address 255 hosts. A subnet mask splits an IP address into two parts. The first part is the network address or network ID. The second part is the host address. The network portion of an IP address corresponds to the 255s in the subnet mask. For a standard Class A network, the subnet mask is 255.0.0.0 since the first octet is used to identify networks and the remaining three octets are used for host addresses. CIDR, sometimes pronounced CIDR, stands for Classless Inter-Domain Routing. It allows networks to be subdivided regardless of their traditional class by explicitly assigning subnet masks. These subdivided networks are called subnets. Also, there are IP addresses that are dedicated for use in private networks. These private addresses are also called non-routable IPs since they are not routed through the public internet. To show the current IP address of your Linux server or to get a list of all the IP addresses in use on your Linux system, run IP space address or ifconfig. That's ifconfig. At this point, really, the ifconfig utility is considered deprecated, but you can still find it installed by default on many Linux distributions. A host is a device connected to a network. Since we're talking about TCP/IP networking, a host in this case is a device with an IP address. A hostname, on the other hand, is simply a human readable name that corresponds to an IP address. You could run the hostname command to display the hostname of your Linux system. You can also run uname --n. If you want to display the FQDN or fully qualified domain name, run hostname --f. The etc host file on a Linux system contains a list of IP addresses and host names. After you create an entry in etc host, you can start communicating with that IP address by using the name you specified in the host file. This can be useful if you want to communicate with computers that do not have DNS host names. Also, it's a common practice to override the DNS entry of a system. For example, if you have a cluster of web servers, you probably have a private network that only the web cluster members can access. You can create an entry for those members of the cluster in the etc host file and use their private addresses, thus forcing network communications through the private network. Typically, the etc host file is checked first before a DNS server is queried, but you can actually change this behavior by editing the etc nsswitch.conf file. NSS stands for Name Service Switch, and it controls the order in which lookups are performed. The primary purpose of DNS, which stands for Domain Name System, is to translate human readable names into IP addresses. Of course, DNS does the reverse too, as it can translate IP addresses into host names. If you want to look up or resolve a DNS name or an IP address, you can use the host or dig tools. In their most simplest forms, you just specify the IP address or DNS name that you want to look up as an argument to one of those commands, and they'll reply with the appropriate response. Just like IP addresses identify hosts on a network, ports identify the services on a host. When a service starts on a system, it binds itself to a port and listens for traffic destined for that port. Ports range from 1 to 65,535. Ports from 1 through 1023 are called well-known ports or system ports. These ports are pre-assigned ports and are used for common system services. These ports are also called privileged ports since it requires super user privileges to open these ports. Ports above 1024 can be opened and used by normal users on a system and are called unprivileged ports. DHCP stands for Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. DHCP is primarily used to assign IP addresses to hosts on a network. You have to decide if you want the network interfaces on your system to use DHCP or static addresses. For Red Hat-based systems, this configuration is stored in the etc sysconfig network-scripts directory. There is a configuration file for each network interface on the system in that directory. For Debian-based distros like Ubuntu, the network configuration is stored in the etc network interfaces file. You can manually assign IP addresses to network interfaces by using the IP or ifconfig commands. However, many Linux distributions include ifup and ifdown scripts that can be used to easily bring a network interface up or down. Now quickly, a GUI is a graphical user interface and a TUI is a textual user interface. Some distros come with GUI or TUI tools that you can use to configure these network settings on a Linux server instead of editing the configuration files by hand. These tools include nmtui and system-config-network for Red Hat-based systems and YAST for SUSE systems. One Linux system can be running multiple processes and obviously performing many different tasks at the same time. To query the process table and see what processes are currently running on a system, use the ps command. The most helpful options to ps are actually -ef, which shows every process in a full format listing. So remember ps space -ef. If you want to stop the execution of a command that you entered in on the command line, simply type Control-C. If you want to suspend that currently running foreground process, type Control-Z. To send that suspended process to the background so that it keeps running, use the BG command. When you're ready to bring that job back to the foreground, type FG. To display a list of jobs, use the jobs command. If you want to kill a process or a job, use the kill command and supply the process ID or the job ID. If you need to repeat a task on a schedule, use the Cron service. The Cron service is a time-based job scheduling service that starts when the system boots. Cron jobs are often used to automate a process or perform routine system maintenance, such as rotating log files to free up disk space. You can schedule cron jobs by using the cron tab command. You can see the format of a cron job here on your screen. If you're going to be using Linux systems, then you need to know how to install software on them. Well, packages are used to do that on Linux systems. You can manipulate packages with a package manager. And two of the most popular package formats are RPM and Debian, or Deb for short. For RPM-based distributions like Red Hat and CentOS, use the yum and RPM commands to manage packages. For Debian-based distributions like Ubuntu, use apt and dpkg. If you enjoyed this video, then I know you're going to love my Linux Administration Bootcamp course available at Udemy. This course is designed so that you don't have to have any previous Linux experience. If you do, that's great, but it's not required because I'm going to take you from the very beginning and guide you step by step all along the way. By the end of the course, you'll not only be a competent Linux user, you'll also have enough skills to start working as a Linux system administrator. To get the absolute lowest price available for this course, use the coupon code in the description below. It's an exclusive discount for viewers of this YouTube channel. By the way, this course also comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee, which means you have everything to gain and nothing to lose by trying it out. So if you want to learn Linux system administration and supercharge your career, enroll today. I hope to see you in class.
Hello. Hello, sir. Video संपला. Hello. Hello. कृपया जबीन चोगले आपला माईक बंद करावे. जबीन चोगले. घर में अंदर अंदर
ये जबीन माइक बंद कर.
कृपया जबीन चोगले आपला माईक बंद करावे. हॅलो सर, आपला व्हिडिओ संपलेला आहे आज. Hello, sir. Are you there? Hello, sir. Shall we leave this lecture or not?
Hello.
Hello, Aftab AK, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there.
Yeah, bro, what are you doing? Let's try to talk like foreigners. हॅलो जबीन चोगले, आपला माईक बंद करावे. कृपया करून माईक चालू न ठेवता. हॅलो हो जमीर, कृपया राणे शीतल व्हॉट्सअप वरून मेसेज न करा. फोकस आपल्या लेक्चर वर ठेवा. शीतल राणे, लेक्चर संपलाय हो, तरी पण विषय फार गंभीर आहे ना. गंभीर म्हणजे काय? फॉरेनची इंग्लिश म्हणजे काय? आला इंडियाची इंग्लिश येत नाही, फॉरेनची इंग्लिश ऐकताय म्हणजे काय? काय साधी गोष्ट आहे काय? व्हायला सबस्क्राईब टू माय चॅनल, तेच चालू आहे सगळ्यांचं. हॅलो सर, हॅलो. तन्वी गोसावीने आपलं माईक चालू केलंय याच संघाने. तन्वी गोसावी, तुमचं हार्दिक हार्दिक स्वागत आहे आपल्या ह्या दुपारच्या लेक्चरला. मोठ्याने वरून काहीही उपयोग नाहीये, कारण सर म्यूट करून आपला लॅपटॉप समोर ठेवून गेलेले आहेत. बहुतेक सरांची जरा रिक्वेस्ट करायला लागेल. आफताब कोंडेकर, तुम्हाला रिक्वेस्ट करण्यात येते की सरांना तुम्ही कॉल लावून सांगा. आफताब कोंडेकर, कृपया निकिता लाडला रिक्वेस्ट करण्यात येते की लिव्ह हो असं मेसेज टाकू नका.
अरे जमीर,
हा बोला साहेब.
काय बेसिस ना?
दुआ आहे तुझी, बस काय.
जेवलोस?
हो जेवलो नाही रे अजून, दुपारचं जेवण नाश्ता झालं फक्त.
का दिलं ना जेवण?
नाही जेवण देतात रे, आपला कसं टाइम टू टाइम असतं ना. टाइम ते आता नमाज पडीन, नमाज पडल्यानंतर मजा येईल.
ह्यो लेक्चर कुणाचा होता?
ह्यो आपलं लेक्चर होतं लिनक्सचा.
अरे तो माहितीये म्हणा, कच्च्या सरचा होता.
सर आपले सर नाही आहेत आता. कापडी सर आपला
आणि
एकटाच सर आहे.
हॉस
सत्य
कोण
एक.
करतो? कापडी सर?
हो, आपला
अच्छा.
करता करता कापडी सर आहे यंदा.
हो, SYC TY पर्यंत.
हो, अजून काय खत गेलीत काय माहिती आहे, अजून काय आलेत नाही ऑनलाईन.
चला मग आता लिव्ह करा.
काम येऊ दे ना तर बोलला याला न विचारता देव केला, याला काही रिस्पेक्ट वगैरे काय आहे की नाही वगैरे.
हो हो बरोबर.
कृपया निकिता लाड प्रायव्हेटला मेसेज करू नका. हो व्हिडिओ संपलाय राणे. तर आपलं कसं आहे जरा
नाटक आलेत काय जायला.
कृपया जोरात बोलू नका. कधी पण सर येऊ शकतात आणि तुम्हाला शिव्या टाकू शकतात. मग जरा आपली
व्हिडिओ संपले आता.
आता व्हिडिओ कॉल चालू करा. सगळ्यांनी आपला आपला व्हिडिओ कॉल चालू करा आणि समोरचा आपला जे काही आहे ते दाखवा. म्हणजे काय बोलतात नेचर.
जमीर त्या व्हिडिओ पेक्षा तुझं बोलणं ऐकून कंटाळा आला आम्हाला, म्हणून फायनली तो माईक चालू करून बोलले मी. मेलाच
हो हो हो
समीर चल तुझा कॅमेरा चालू कर.
थँक्यू तुमचा खूप
जमीर.
आम्ही आभार हे करतोय.
अरे
काय
जमीर.
पुष्पगुच्छ वगैरे काय पाहिजेत का तुम्हाला?
जमीर.
हा दादा बोला ना.
कोणाला?
व्हिडिओ चालू
तुम्हाला
करतोय बघून
राणे शीतल
सुट्टीत किती
राणेला.
गोरा दिलास.
गोरा नाही रे, इकडे आयला ऊन पडतं आमच्या इकडं.
आमच्या इकडे निंबर पडतोय.
निंबर पडतंय?
पाऊस
हो
राहण्याचे तर पाऊस पडते लगेच. काय
आता गेलाय पाऊस, आता ऊन पडले.
आमच्या इथं ऊन बघ काय पडलंय आयला बेकार. अरे माझा मोबाईल फ्रंटचा कॅमेरा चाललाय नाही रे बरोबर, शॉर्ट जाईल.
गोरा दिसत नसेल म्हणून चालू करत नसेल माहिती मला.
अरे नाही रे मोबाईल बिघडला ना, आता नवीन घ्यायचंय. अरे आमच्या इथे काय आलं माहितीये काय, कोल्हा आलेत कोल्हा.
तू असताना?
अरे तू असताना म्हणजे आमचे जंगल आहे ना आमचं मोठा. हो 4 आहेत, त्याची आई पण आहे, पण आईची जरा ओळख नाही झाली आहे. पोरांबरोबर ओळख झाली आहे.
अच्छा बंद करू काय? 12:30 झाले तरी.
हा चला सगळ्यांनी बंद करा. हे थांबायला की काय?
मेसेज कर, सरना मेसेज कर, बोल व्हिडिओ. आता
सर्वांनी मेसेज टाका सर आम्ही लिव्ह करतोय आणि चला निघा सगळ्यांनी एक एक करून.
तू आधी लिव्ह कर मेसेज टाका.
अरे आम्ही कसं आम्ही लास्टला जाणार रे, म्हणजे सीआर ना.
गप्पे.
याला कोंबडा कोणाचा वाजतोय रे? कृपया निकिता लाड कुठे आहेत?
गेली ती जेवायला गेली.
तन्वी गोसावी बघ आयला जेवत बसली वाटते, माईक पण चालू करे नाही. तन्वी
बाबा